Hey guys, it's Makeshift. Welcome to the first video in my plush clothes patterning series. There are many ways to pattern clothing for your plushies, and I'll discuss them briefly in this first video. The remainder of this series will be demonstrating the paper towel patterning method, which is one of my favorite techniques. I'll be demonstrating that by patterning the button-up shirt and the pants on this plush that I'm making. Let's get started. The first option is to draw the clothing pattern on paper completely from scratch. This pattern could be as simple or complex as you'd like. For example, for a shirt it could be a single pattern piece that includes both the sleeves and the body of the shirt. This is not how actual shirts are sewn, but if you're making a very simple small plush without much detail, this may be a good option for you. But for larger or more complex plush, the look of a simplified clothing pattern might not look good. In this example, you'd want to separate the sleeves from the body of the shirt like how actual shirt patterns are. However, the shape of a sleeve cap where it attaches to the armhole of a shirt is complex, and it's hard to draft this from scratch. This is why I wouldn't recommend this approach unless you have experience with making real clothes for people, since a lot of the pattern pieces for clothing are not intuitive to be drawn free-handed. I hardly ever do this method myself. The second option is to purchase some mass-produced clothing for a plush and to take it apart for the pattern. The most common brand you'll see here are Build-A-Bear clothes. This approach will be simplest if your plush can fit into the clothes you're purchasing without any modifications, but even if your plush doesn't fit into it, you can alter the size and the shapes of the patterns to make it work. First, you would purchase the type of clothing you would want to make. You can buy this secondhand on places like eBay or Mercari. You would want to purchase it cheap since you're going to be taking it apart. You could possibly put it back together, but the fabric might fray and it might become difficult to sew it back together. Once you receive the clothing, you need to seam rip it apart. You would trace these pieces onto paper. Consider the seam allowance of the clothes that you're taking apart. You may need to add a little bit more if they're very narrow seams. You can see the stitch lines on this piece right here, and it's right up against the edge of the fabric, so I need to add more seam allowance to this pattern piece. Once you get all the pattern pieces traced onto paper, you can make any modifications as needed. If the clothes are too big, you will need to make them smaller in some way. The way I do it is by scanning pattern pieces into my computer and using photo editing software like Photoshop or GIMP to make them smaller. Make sure that you're marking the sewing line on your pattern here, because your seam allowance will also shrink at this point, and you will need to add more if you shrink your pattern significantly. You can go ahead and print them out once you've shrunk the pattern pieces. Once you get all your pattern pieces together, if you don't need any modifications, you can go ahead and cut them out of fabric and sew it all together. If you need some advice on how to sew together a shirt, which can be kind of confusing because of the sleeves, you can check out the later part of my paper towel patterning video on a button-up shirt, which goes over how I sew together shirts. There may be other changes that you'd like to make for the style or the fit of the clothing. Here's an example of when I did this. I bought a hoodie to take apart for Peachy, but there were several changes that needed to be made. The hood needed to be made larger to fit over her head since my plush had different proportions than the plush that I was buying a mass-produced clothing from. The neckline also needed to be changed into a V shape rather than being tight around the neck. The sleeves also needed to be made longer to hit right around the wrist, and the bottom needed to be shortened into a crop top. To do this, I saved the original patterns once tracing them from the fabric and then copied them again onto a second piece of paper. Then I altered the second version so I wouldn't lose the pattern of the original version just in case I ever wanted to use it. A lot of these edits just involved adding extra length to the existing pattern pieces. Often, edits that you'll need to make to existing clothing patterns will be simple and straightforward. But if you find that you're needing to make a ton of edits to make it the way that you want, you may want to consider another method. And that method is the paper towel patterning method. It involves draping paper towels over the actual plush to create the clothing that you want. You're essentially making clothes out of paper towels. Then you draw the seams onto the clothes you've created where they would typically land on real clothing items. You cut it apart for the pattern, and then you trace it onto paper to preserve the pattern since it's typically fragile since it's made out of paper towels. This is a fantastic option if you have an unusual shaped plush that can't fit into mass-produced clothing, or if you'd like to make something really unique. I've used this for many things, like the pattern on Tidbit the clown cat. His onesie was very unique, so I found that the paper towel patterning method was the best way to go. It's also a super cheap method since you only have to purchase paper towels, which you probably already have. So let's move over to the next video in the series to go more in depth on the paper towel patterning method.